Hello dear students, today the topic of our discussion shall be the colonial loot of India. In the course of the lectures, we will find out how the British's ideology of pilfering the colonies led to the destruction of the Indian economy. The Britishers destroyed the Indian economy, its trade, its agriculture via its various colonistic and imperialistic policies. See, it was a common practice in Europe that these European countries ventured out of Europe to find colonies. Thanks to the naval development, thanks to the development of ships that could sail for a greater distance, these European countries ventured out into the world seeking forming colonies. Now, their objective behind colonizing a region is to pilfer the resources only. The imperialist's objective is merely to grab the resources. It does not have any inclination for administrative or reformative actions in the regions. But in case of India, it was a bit different because India was not only a colony that exported raw material to Europe, that is Britain, it also was cultivated as a major market that could absorb the finished products. Now, prior to the British rule in India, India dominated the 70% of the world trade happened via India. A simple idea of how trade occurs. We all know resources are not equally distributed among the continents. Some regions have different resources, whereas others have a scarcity in such resources. Therefore, to meet the resource balance, two entities. In those times, we had kingdoms. Kingdom A used to engage in trade with Kingdom B. Now, the government didn't participate in the trade directly. There was a group of merchants called as guilds or traders who would facilitate the trade. See, a resource from A used to travel to B, and in exchange, they would be given gold. And in the same way, if A wanted to import something from A, they would use gold. The balance of payment was hugely in favor of India. See, today you have your elite merchandise such as Gucci, Fendi, Prada. The Indian textiles of that of the European colonial time was the Gucci and Fendi and Prada for Europeans at that time. So therefore, Indian exports, mainly the textile, was of high value in the European regions. Therefore, India dominated the trade. 70%. Even today, China and USA combined do not contribute to 70% of the trade in India. That was how powerful Indian trade was. As we know, whenever we export a lot, today we get dollars, but before the world wars, the trade used to occur in gold. Therefore, you see a lot of gold coming into India because we imported very few luxurious items such as horses, wines, etc. Because India is a self-sufficient country. It has the necessary resources for functioning. Therefore, only luxurious and unique resources were imported. Whereas the major trade happened via export. India was a major exporter during the time. Indian agriculture blossomed. The Indian agriculture, each grain, each crop has various indigenous varieties. See, there is no rice, say example rice. There is not only one type of rice, there are various indigenous species of rice. In India, all the various species of different food grains were under cultivation, and each species requires a different type of agricultural input and practices. Therefore, India was having rich variety of crops which would sustain them even in case of climatic change, And India also had various different agricultural practice. Agricultural practice means the ways and means of growing the crops. They were also of various kinds. Now, the trade blossomed, agriculture was very good. Therefore, the economic prosperity of our country was well. There was a lot of industries, your handlooms, textiles, art and artifacts, etc., vases, pottery, etc. A lot of industries also bloomed in our country. See, industries used to produce the commodity, agriculture used to produce commodities which would all be traded and helping, which would help the coffers of the India. So from such a strong position, when the Britishers left India, India had a situation of ship to mouth. The agriculture within India, which was surplus in the pre-colonial era, had become so deficient that India had to import food grains from America. The industries was left in such a state that there was no industry post in 1947 which could produce even a matchbox. Matchbox was essential at that time because electricity has not made much penetration into the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, use of matchbox was prevalent. So, in 1947, India did not have the industrial capacity to even produce a matchbox. So, the trade was completely against India. India, which was a huge exporter, I said it used to export 70% of the total world's demand, had become a major importer. It used to, see, in pre-colonial times, India exported finished product. That is your textile, let's say saris. But during post-colonial era, India did not export, whereas it imported said saris and food grains. The nature of trade completely changed. In the dynamics of trade, exporting finished products are always more valuable compared to raw materials. Merely exporting raw materials will not garner much profit, whereas that cotton, if you merely exporting, let's say merely exporting cotton to Europe would not give you much money. But if that cotton, thanks to the Indian industries, would be converted into cloth, and that piece of cloth would be sold as a precious commodity in Europe, which would fetch a lot of profit. So that is how the Europeans changed the scenario of India. Now, how did this happen? See, it did not happen over time. It took them about 180 years to destroy the Indian economy. First, we will learn about trade. See, pre-colonial rule, East India, there was a company called as East India. Today we have various companies. In the same way, East India Company was also a company that was created in Britain. Its major components were merchants. It was a company of merchants or traders. Now, who are these traders? I told you, these traders are the people that facilitate trade between country A and country B. These traders go to country B, buy the commodities and sell that at a premium back to the country A. That is how the traders operated. So the group of traders together formed the East India Company. It is said that even the Queen of London was heavily invested in this company. Now, what makes this company unique is that it is not just an economic entity. Since the Queen had interest, and major nobles of the time, the lords as they call, had a lot of interest within the East India Company, had invested a lot in the East India Company. They armed the East India Company with an army. Today we have numerous companies, but these companies do not have an army. It is the governments which have an army, whereas East India Company had military support, because it is the job of these companies to venture out into the world and create colonies for the exploit the economic resources of the country. So that is a brief idea of East India Company. Now, prior to the Battle of Plassey, prior to colonization, we had the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who gave permission to the East India Company to trade. It is simple. When we see, when today's world, when any product comes from outside, there is a fixed set of customs duties which are applied, and based on that customs duty, the trade occurs. So therefore, Jahangir merely gave the permission to trade with India. See, before this, Indian traders facilitated the trade. Indian traders did not directly trade to Europe. They sold their products to the Arabian Peninsula and so on. From Central Asia, these Central Asian merchants again sold the item to Europe, making it very costly. Therefore, everyone in Europe knew the value of Indian commodities. Therefore, the East India Company secured the permission of Jahangir to trade within India. There was also a ruler of Bijapur who let the Britishers to establish a factory in Masulipattnam. Now, what is a factory? Factory in the sense they did not produce anything. It was merely a site. In this region, it was a type of a fortified region where East India Company officials used to hold the commodities. Now, what would happen pre-colonial era was, these officials would go into the Indian markets. They would buy products from the local merchants. Say, the East India Company people wanted to buy cloth. They went to the merchants or vendors and bought cloth. As we know, during those times, trade occurred in either gold or bullion. Therefore, the East India Company officials paid gold to the merchants and secured the product, while also paying the customs duty to the government, with the ruling entity. Now, those commodities were held in this factory and which were sent to Britain. Now, that piece of cloth that was bought by East India Company merchants was sold in Europe at a premium price, giving them a profit. This is how the trade occurred pre-colonization, which was the natural way of things to occur. But after the Battle of Plassey in 1765, the Britishers acquired, this was the beginning of the end of the Indian economy. In 1765, Britishers acquired Diwani rights. Today, the government is responsible for collecting taxes. In those times, it was the officers delegated by the king or the ruler to collect taxes. But since the Bengal region lost to the Britishers, they had to give Diwani rights of 3 villages, Mindapur, Govindapur, so on. 3 villages were given to the British. Now, British did not act as a law and order or enforcer of law in these 3 villages. They merely had Diwani rights, which is they could collect taxes. Now, this is a major turn for the East India Company officials. Prior to acquiring Diwani rights, to procure the product from Indian merchants, they had to shell out gold or bullion. But now, since they have Diwani rights of these three villages, the taxes which they gained from these villages was used to buy the commodity. Let's say the piece of cloth. Before 1965, to buy a piece of cloth, East India Company met the shopkeeper and provided them with gold and bullion. Whereas after 1765, they collected local revenue, and this local revenue was used to buy the finished product, and that was which was again sold at a premium to the European Union. So here we see now major drawback of this process is that gold which was entering India from Europe stopped. Now the East India Company didn't require to use the gold. They merely collected taxes from the indigenous regions, the villages, and used those tax money as the means of procuring the finished product. So in the sense, this is the beginning of the end of the Indian economy. In the future, post Battle of Buxar, India, these Britishers slowly gained the administrative powers in which they decided the trades and tariffs. They started interfering in the economy directly. The further part will be explained in the upcoming classes.